It has been revealed that Dmitry Medvedev met with senior American officials. Medvedev, known as Vladimir Putin's friend, made a deal with America and Israel to take Putin's throne. Dmitry Medvedev, who has been the Russian president for many years, held a secret meeting with senior American officials. While there are many question marks about the whereabouts of Medvedev, who has not appeared in front of the cameras in recent weeks, it has been learned that Medvedev is doing some things behind Putin's back. Medvedev, who made a deal with America and Israel to bring the end of Vladimir Putin, wants to overthrow Putin and sit on the throne again. Recently, Dmitry Medvedev's statements about the war between Russia and Ukraine attracted everyone's attention. Medvedev, known as a close friend of Vladimir Putin, was one of the first to support the Russian army's occupation of Ukrainian territory in the first months of the war. However, the prolongation of the war and the interaction of the US and Western countries in the war led to a change in Medvedev's decisions. In recent months, US officials have revealed that Israel has been secretly supplying ammunition to the Ukrainian army after the Israeli leadership acknowledged the US allegations. Russian leader Vladimir Putin said that Israel's support for Ukraine was unacceptable and would damage relations between Russia and Israel. Dmitry Medvedev, however, had a very different view. He said that Israel's support for Ukraine, which has been neutral since the beginning of the war, was its own decision and would not be a problem for relations between Russia and Israel. Medvedev said that countries that go to war can always have different allied states on their side, and that Israel's support for Ukraine is quite normal. However, Medvedev's statements angered Vladimir Putin. Putin, who held a private meeting with Medvedev in the Kremlin, is said to have reached the point of dismissing Medvedev. According to information obtained from sources close to the Kremlin, Medvedev, who is currently serving as the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, is said to be threatened by Putin. Months after this conversation between Putin and Medvedev, Dmitry Medvedev traveled to the United States on a private plane and held a meeting with senior American and Israeli officials. It is said that Medvedev is now being supported by the US and Israel, and that the protests and riots that are taking place in Russia are being financed by Medvedev. Medvedev, who was the Russian president for years, was forced to resign by Vladimir Putin in recent years and replaced by Mikhail Mishustin after Medvedev resigned from his post. He started to have disagreements with Russian leader Vladimir Putin on many issues. The war between Russia and Ukraine is one of the issues on which Medvedev and Putin have disagreements. The US administration, which wants to turn Medvedev's hostility towards Putin into an opportunity, is carrying out a secret plan to overthrow Vladimir Putin by choosing Medvedev to their side. The Russian intelligence service stated that there is a secret bank account opened in the name of Dmitry Medvedev, and that large amounts of money are coming into this account from the US and Israel. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu raised the question of the purpose of these unrequited funds coming into Medvedev's account and then accused Medvedev of betraying Russia. Medvedev, however, preferred to remain silent on the issue and did not make any statement. It turned out that Medvedev had been using the money he had received from the US and Israel for a long time to organize anti-Putin protests within Russia. It is a well-known fact that after the Russian army invaded Ukraine, many protests were organized within Russia. Most of these demonstrations are organized by people who are anti-Putin. However, Putin fears that his throne will be taken away because of these protests. So it's trying to prevent all protests across the country by giving full authority to Russian security forces. However, Medvedev is also said to be in secret cooperation with Russian opposition officials and to be organizing anti-Putin protests within Russian borders. Medvedev, with the financial support of the US and Israel, has established many organizations in Russia and is gathering anti-Putin people in these organizations. Every Russian citizen who becomes a member of the organization is paid a certain amount every month in the form of a salary. The only thing that the members of this organization have to do is to organize and to put in protests in various spots of the country. These organizations, mostly made up of anti-Putin Russian citizens and minorities, have led protests in many cities due to the rising inflation rates and the turbulent economy in Russia. The anger of the Russian people against Putin has increased considerably. For this reason, Russian citizens support these protests organized by Medvedev's organizations in a very short time. Thus, large-scale protests can be organized as Medvedev wishes. However, the Russian intelligence service has determined that the money coming into Medvedev's account comes from America and Israel. It would not be surprising if an investigation is launched against Medvedev in the near future. Although there have been Medvedev-backed protests in Russia, not all of them have been planned. The Russian army's losses on Ukrainian soil have been increasing. The longer the war lasts, having more lost. More than 175,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war. Russia is going through a very bad period. This, in turn, is causing the anger of the Russian people towards Putin to grow even more. Before the Russian army invaded Ukrainian territory on February 24 last year, Vladimir Putin said in a statement that the occupation of Ukraine would last for a few weeks and that no Russian soldiers would be harmed. But Vladimir Putin has not kept any of these promises. The Russian people are also very disturbed by Putin's failure to disclose the Russian military casualties in the war in Ukraine. While the Ukrainian government regularly announces the casualties on both sides, the Russian government is very silent on this issue. Vladimir Putin says that it is out of question to disclose these losses of the Russian army, that they are a state secret. Putin, who forcibly recruited 300,000 Russian citizens into the Russian army with the decision of partial mobilization, thought that with the increase in the number of soldiers, he could speed up his occupation of Ukrainian territory. But he was wrong. Although many expert researchers warned that these inexperienced citizens would do more harm than good to the Russian army, Putin did not give up on this decision. The fact that the majority of the citizens included in the army by Putin were from minority populations drove even greater reactions. It was revealed that more than 60% of the 300,000 Russian citizens included in the army were minority citizens. Minority citizens living in autonomous republics such as Crimea and Dagestan were identified by Russian soldiers and forcibly included in the army. However, after a while, these minority soldiers sent to Ukrainian territories started to cause various problems within the army. Minority soldiers who decided to lay down their arms in the headquarters occupied by the Russian army in Ukraine started to disobey the orders of their commanders. Minority soldiers stated that basic needs such as food and medicine sent to the headquarters were not given to them, and most of them were distributed to Russian soldiers and Wagner soldiers. The minority soldiers organized protests on the battlefield with anti-war posters and refused to fight for several weeks. However, these soldiers who refused to fight were arrested by Vladimir Putin after a while. Russian leader Putin decided to send the Russian National Guard known as Rosgvardia into Ukrainian territory. These National Guardsmen were tasked with suppressing Russian soldiers who engaged in indiscipline and attempted mutiny on Ukrainian territory. The National Guard was also authorized to shoot and arrest Russian soldiers who caused problems within the army. The patience of the Russian soldiers who did not expect the war to last this long is exhausted. For this reason, many Russian soldiers are looking for a way to escape from the front and leave Ukrainian territory. More than 1,000 Russian soldiers were caught by the Russian National Guard while trying to leave the battlefield. These captured soldiers are being taken back to Russia and are being tried in prison. But the latest decision taken by Vladimir Putin, the penalty for fleeing the battlefield was decided to be imprisonment between 5 and 10 years. The most crucial clashes of the ongoing Ukrainian war are undoubtedly taking place in Bakhmut and Mariupol. Both cities have been razed to the ground by the bombardment of the Russian army. The southern offensive of the Ukrainian army gained great importance towards the recapture of Crimea. The southern offensive, which started last spring, reached its first stage with the Ukrainian army recapturing the city of Kherson in the first place. During the remainder of the time, the Ukrainian army advanced in the Zaporizhia region, as well as Kherson. Especially the advances in Zaporizhia brought Ukraine closer to another route to Crimea. Mariupol, the city of Mariupol, was considered an important strategic city and target for the Russian forces. The city is the largest city in the Donetsk Oblast and was also one of the largest Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine. Mariupol was an important industrial center, home to the Illik and Azovstal iron and steelworks, and the largest city in the Sea of Azov. Control of its port on the western coast of the Sea of Azov is vital to the Ukrainian economy. The city allows the passage of Russian maritime traffic, as well as a land route for Russia to the Crimea. Capturing the city was important to give Russia full control over the Sea of Azov. As a matter of fact, in the conflicts that have been going on for a year, the city is vulnerable to heavy attacks by Ukraine, even though it is under Russian control. The Ukrainian army is struggling to regain control of Mariupol. The positive results of these efforts allow the Ukrainian army to increase its superiority over the Russians. So what else would it take to regain control of Mariupol? The superiority of the Ukrainian army in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions in recent months is well known. The Ukrainian army is aware that the road to Mariupol passes through Zaporizhia and continues its attacks against this region. Undoubtedly, the most important place of the Zaporizhia region is Mariupol. The Ukrainian army has focused its efforts on the city to expel the Russian presence in Mariupol. In the evening yesterday, two powerful explosions shook the military bases of the Russian army in Melitopol. Two powerful explosions were heard in the northern areas of the city. There is information that two objects on which Russian troops were deployed were destroyed. According to preliminary information, at least 300 Russian soldiers were killed. The Ukrainian General Staff has not yet released the exact figures, but the exact number of Russian soldiers who died recently and Russian army casualties will be given. On the same day, at least two more explosions occurred in Melitopol, according to local witnesses. Two explosions were heard simultaneously in several neighborhoods in the north and west of the city. In addition, an explosion occurred at an airport in the city of Melitopol. Earlier this week, the Russian military base located at the Melitopol airport has been shaken by explosions dozens of times throughout the year. As can be seen in these systematic attacks on Melitopol, the Russian army is vulnerable to any Ukrainian attack, and it is likely that the Russian army will withdraw from the city in case of an attack against the city. The successive attacks that have taken place in Melitopol for a long time are disrupting the Russian supply and shipping line between Mariupol and Crimea. The primary purpose of these attacks is to cut off the connection of the Russian army in Ukraine with the Crimea following attacks that developed over the week. The Kremlin administration ordered that Melitopol be designated as the administrative center of the Russian-controlled part of the Zaporizhia region. We speculate that this order was clearly given by the Kremlin administration in retaliation for the Ukrainian attacks. This gives us the impression that the clashes that will take place in Melitopol will be even more intense in the future and will be equivalent to the Battle of Bakhmut. So how can Ukraine reach Mariupol via Melitopol compared to Mariupol? The Russian presence in Melitopol is now less, and the Russian defense here looks rather weak. Although the ground getting heavier with the winter months and not allowing any ground operations has increased the air attacks of the Ukrainian army against this city. We can see the first wave of the Ukrainian attacks, which will start with the arrival of spring towards Mariupol. Although the attacks against both Melitopol and Mariupol by the Ukrainian army are currently continuing at full speed, no clear result has been achieved. For this, it is necessary to cut the logistics of these cities as a difficult step. So what is Ukraine doing to prevent Russian logistics in this region? The Ukrainian attack on the logistics facilities of the Russian army in Mariupol made a lot of noise because, for example, after this attack, there were speculations in the information space that Ukraine received the Goldsby long-range missile systems with a firing range of up to 150 kilometers. Moreover, some official speakers began to have implied that the armed forces now have more opportunities to attack Russian troops in Mariupol. But the questions in the minds of the Russian military may have been answered by the Ukrainian defense forces with samples of weapons already available. For example, GMORS guided missiles with a firing range of up to 84 kilometers fired from M270 or M142 HIMARS contain the most correct answer to these questions. If you measure on the map, then actually from the front line to the Russian objects in Mariupol, it is only a little more than 50 miles. And this alone would allow the GMORS to be fired along the ridges in this area at a range of up to 84 kilometers. However, this must be a very risky operation because the Ukrainian artillery here will have to be positioned closer to the front line than usual. In turn, it should be taken into account even at the planning stage when the success of this or that operation with a missile attack on the rear of the Russian army actually depends not only on a particular type of weapon, but also on a number of factors. For example, the availability of suitable routes for rapid entry and exit to the location, the density of air defense systems that do not allow the Russians to capture Ukrainian systems, missiles, and insufficient and constantly missing Russian air defense are some of these factors. So what does Russia think about the Mariupol attacks in particular? Russia is concerned about unexplained explosions in Mariupol, which Russia previously considered possibly beyond Ukraine's routine offensive capability. Russian officials said they reported at least 14 explosions around the Russian military-controlled city of Mariupol in the past week alone. The location of the incidents include an ammunition depot at the airport, 2 fuel depots, and a steel mill that Russia uses as a military base. Referring to the fact that Mariupol is located at least 80 kilometers from the front line, Russian officials stated that they will take some steps to prevent Ukraine's long-range attacks. Although largely devastated before in the war, Mariupol is important to Russia because it is the largest city Russia captured and still controls in 2022 and sits on an important logistics route. But most of Mariupol is in ruins, and tens of thousands of people died in the city, from which more than half of the pre-war population of about 450,000 fled. Thousands of bodies were buried in a large area northwest of Mariupol, according to Ukrainian officials and eyewitnesses. Mariupol was a strategically important target for Russia. It has been heavily bombed from the air and land since the beginning of the war, when it came under Russian control in May. Much of the city was destroyed and thousands of civilians died. Recent satellite images show that the 3 major mass graves at Stary, Krim, Manhush and Vinohradny near Mariupol have been gradually expanding since the spring months. Examining incoming satellite images, officials revealed that 1,500 more bodies have been buried in the tomb since their last examination in June. It is estimated that more than 4,600 bodies have been buried here since the beginning of the war. However, it is not known exactly how many graves there are in total. Ukrainian officials say that at least 25,000 people lost their lives during the war in Mariupol, and between 5,000 and 7,000 people whose homes were destroyed were buried under the rubble. Russian forces have been devoting considerable resources to the flanks in order to take control of the trenches in front of the home of the highway and advance on Bakhmut from the west. However, some formations refused to cooperate with Wagner forces, leading to an immediate successful counterattack by Ukrainians, which caused a massive feud inside the Russian army. Last time I told you that Ukrainian and Russian forces had prolonged and brutal clashes in the trenches in front of the home of a highway. I also told you that in the aftermath of the last counterattack, Ukrainians managed to re-establish control over the trenches between the highway and the field road. The freshest reports indicate that Russians did not give up on their attempts to establish physical control over the road. Recent geolocated footage showed that Russians started using tanks to support their infantry in field attacks. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian artillery delivered a direct hit from the second attempt and instantly destroyed it. Ukrainian drone operators also recently released a video showing how they were targeting Russian units northeast of Bodanovka. They detected a small reconnaissance group and destroyed it with a kamikaze drone. In the meantime, the Ukrainian fighters from the elite 3rd Assault Brigade continued storming Russian positions in the trenches. The combat footage revealed that Ukrainians were heavily relying on drone operators. The operation started with a sudden drone attack on the Russians during the first stage of the operation. Ukrainians just used grenade-dropping drones and very quickly inflicted huge losses on unsuspecting Russians who were either sleeping or digging in. After that, several armored vehicles delivered the infantry, which immediately jumped into the trenches and initiated close combat fighting in order to reduce the risk. Ukrainians heavily relied on drone operators who communicated the situation behind the corners. This also allowed Ukrainians to throw grenades very effectively, as they would immediately receive a correction or a confirmation from the drone operator. During the most challenging parts of the mission, Ukrainians also used kamikaze drones. Such a guided explosive helped to hit a direct target quickly and precisely. The assault was extremely swift, and it looked like Russians simply did not have enough time to receive artillery support. As a result, Ukrainians left behind dozens of Russian corpses in the trenches. Other footage indicates that Russians are trying to expand the area of operation and overwhelm Ukrainian forces by attacking them simultaneously along the whole Kremova line, and even started attacking Kremova itself. Considering the current setting, the Ukrainian command decided to blow up the pontoon bridge between Kremova and Bakhmut in order to limit Russian possibilities in the case of similar rapid frontline shifts in this region. In the meantime, the Wagner Group started being augmented not only by conventional Russian troops, but also by other private military companies, in particular PMC. This PMC has reportedly taken over responsibility for a newly captured by Wagner forces positions, highly likely somewhere near Hromov. Unfortunately for Wagner's PMC, it did not follow Wagner's orders and allowed Ukrainian forces to recapture the area. What is interesting is that PMC Reddit was created by Gazprom but is subordinate to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is why it may not have followed the order on purpose. This caused an instant and harsh backlash from Prigozhin, who said that completely inept micropunks are undermining the whole Wagner operation as Russian forces get more and more confident about securing Bakhmut. The question of who is going to take the credit started rapidly arising and brought back intense competition and internal politics. If different elements of the Russian army continue competing for who is going to participate in the decisive mission, and reluctant units keep abandoning their positions on the flanks, expecting someone else to step up, then Ukrainians can exploit the weakening of the Russian grip on Bakhmut, prolong the battle, and drain Russian resources for longer, and possibly even find a weak spot in the less protected flanks and undo months of Russian efforts by penetrating Russian defenses.